Thank you, and welcome to today's release of Great Lakes Mercury Connections Report conference call. During the presentation, all lines will be in a listen-only mode. A question-and-answer session will follow the presentation, and instructions for asking questions will be given at that time. Thank you for your attention. I would now like to turn the conference over to your host, Mr. Tim Eder.
Well, good morning again, and thank you, everyone. Today marks a significant milestone for the Great Lakes Commission's Great Lakes Air Deposition Program, which we refer to as the GLAD program. For over a decade, with funding from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Great Lakes Commission has coordinated work to help the Great Lakes states better understand the sources of airborne toxic pollutants, their transport, movement, cycling, and ultimately their fate and impact on human health and wildlife health within the region. Mercury has been a major focus of GLAD-funded research. In 2008, the Commission sponsored a binational scientific synthesis of information on mercury in air, water, fish, and wildlife throughout the Great Lakes region. This effort, led by the Biodiversity Research Institute and University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, brought together more than 170 scientists and environmental managers and resulted in 35 peer-reviewed papers that are being published in special issues of two scientific journals, Ecotoxicology and Environmental Pollution. The report we are issuing today, Great Lakes Mercury Connections, is another valuable product of the partnership between the Biodiversity Research Institute, University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, and the Great Lakes Commission. Information summarized here provides a substantial new body of science to support the states, the provinces, and the federal governments of the U.S. and Canada in their efforts to reduce risk from toxic mercury pollution in the region. The results of this research are directly relevant to regional and national policy decisions. Just last year, the Commission adopted a resolution calling for a comprehensive mercury monitoring program and improved mercury reduction policies. Earlier this year, Senator Collins reintroduced a bill that would establish a comprehensive national mercury monitoring network, and a House version of this bill is expected soon. Later this year, U.S. EPA is expected to finalize their proposed mercury and air toxic standards rule. I'm pleased and honored to be joined this morning by three lead authors of the Great Lakes Mercury Connections report: Dr. Jim Weiner of the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, Dr. David Evers of the Biodiversity Research Institute in Gorham, Maine, and Dr. Charles Driscoll of Syracuse University. And I'll let them explain in more detail the findings and recommendations that emerged from this very important work. And I'm going to first turn it to Jim Weiner. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Tim. Distinguished Research Professor at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Today, we will summarize and discuss findings from a binational synthesis of information on mercury in the Great Lakes region. We are pleased to share some encouraging news, some unexpected findings, some continuing causes for concern, and some positive results that can inform management decisions to further reduce the risks of mercury in the Great Lakes region. The geographic scope of this assessment, shown here in slide 2, includes the 5 Great Lakes and the inland lakes and rivers within the 8 Great Lakes states and the province of Ontario. Human development varies widely across the region, ranging from remote and relatively pristine wilderness in the north to agricultural, urban, and industrialized areas in the south, where most of the sources of mercury are located. Our final speaker, Dr. Charles Driscoll, will present a regional map of mercury emissions. The Great Lakes region contains aquatic, forest, and wetland resources worthy of good stewardship. These resources support recreational, commercial, and tribal fisheries of substantial value. Fishing is an important recreational activity here, and millions of residents and visitors catch and eat fish from regional waters. In 2006, sport fishing in the Great Lakes states supported an estimated 190,000 jobs and had an economic impact estimated at $20 billion. This slide illustrates the principal processes that lead to mercury contamination of our lands, water, fish, and aquatic wildlife. Mercury emissions to the air are the primary source of mercury pollution in the Great Lakes region, and our synthesis has shown that both wet and dry deposition are important in the delivery of mercury from the atmosphere to landscapes in the region. In forested areas, the dry deposition of mercury onto the forest canopy during the growing season often equals or exceeds annual inputs of mercury in wet deposition or rain. Following deposition, mercury can be retained in the soil, and some can be released to the atmosphere, a process called evasion. Some of the deposited mercury enters wetlands and surface waters where it can be converted to methylmercury. Methylmercury is a highly toxic compound that readily accumulates in organisms and can biomagnify to high concentrations in aquatic food webs. The mercury in fish is almost entirely methylmercury, and concentrations in fillets of game fish and in fish-eating wildlife commonly exceed those in water by a factor of 10 million or more. The release of seemingly small amounts of mercury into the environment can have serious consequences for our fish and wildlife resources. Moreover, concentrations of methylmercury in the lower food webs strongly influence concentrations in the predatory fish and wildlife atop these food webs. In North America, the consumption of fish is the primary pathway for human exposure to methylmercury. Although we did not evaluate health risks to humans in our synthesis, the results of prior fish consumption surveys, case studies, and exposure assessments have shown that persons who frequently eat fish from parts of the region risk suffering the adverse health effects of methylmercury exposure. This is an important graphic, and it merits some explanation. The slide illustrates mercury concentrations in fillets of 6 common game fish species: lake trout, largemouth bass, muskellunge, northern pike, smallmouth bass, and walleye. Data from more than 25,000 fish samples collected during 1990 to 2008 across the region were used to construct this graphic, and these data were grouped spatially into 30 by 30 minute grid cells, and grid cells with fewer than 10 samples were excluded from the analysis. These excluded cells are denoted by gray cross-hatching on this slide. Grid cells with mean mercury concentrations exceeding the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency criterion of 0.3 part per million for mercury in fish tissue are color-coded red on the slide. The synthesis shows clearly that methylmercury contamination has degraded the quality of fish produced in parts of the region as a food resource for humans. Concentrations in game fish from many waters, particularly inland lakes and rivers where most recreational fishing is done, exceed criteria for consumption by sensitive populations, which include children and women of childbearing age. A region-wide analysis of mercury concentrations in fillets of 6 game fish species shown here shows that average concentrations in fish exceeded the U.S. EPA human health criterion in 61% of the regional grid cells for which we had sufficient data. Conversely, none of the studied grid cells in the regional map for these species had average mercury concentrations below 0.05 parts per million, a recommended guideline for unrestricted fish consumption by sensitive populations, as proposed by the Great Lakes Fish Advisory Work Group. These results emphasize the importance of adhering to the fish consumption guidelines that have been issued for waters in the region by state, provincial, and tribal institutions. These results also convey the importance of the mercury monitoring programs operated by our state, provincial, and tribal institutions as a foundation for providing fish consumption guidance to persons who eat fish from regional waters. Several recent toxicological studies have shown that the freshwater fish are adversely affected by methylmercury at much lower concentrations than previously recognized, as recent even as, say, 15 years ago. The results of these studies were applied in a risk analysis for 4 game fishes across the Great Lakes region. This slide illustrates mercury concentrations in whole walleyes, and differs from the previous slide, which had mercury concentrations in fillets, but in risk assessments for fish, whole body concentrations are typically used as the metric. A risk assessment for walleye, which is a regionally highly valued game fish, reveals that female fish of reproductive age had estimated mercury concentrations above estimated thresholds of 0.2 parts per million for reproductive effects in 53% of the grid cells for which we had sufficient data. Adverse effects on reproduction of walleyes are considered likely for 17% of the grid cells, which are shown in red, where average whole body concentrations exceeded 0.3 parts per million. The risks of mercury were judged to be greatest for game fishes inhabiting inland waters. Risks of mercury to game fishes inhabiting the 5 Great Lakes were judged to be minimal, which is welcome news. One of the spatial patterns in the analysis of our data on mercury and food webs, fish, and wildlife that may seem surprising is that mercury levels are often higher in northern parts of the region. These seemingly pristine northern areas contain abundant forests and wetlands and are more sensitive to mercury for a number of reasons which are well understood and documented in published studies. First, the forest canopy collects more mercury deposited from the air. Second, wetlands, which are important sites of methylation, are abundant in northern parts of the region. Third, the chemical characteristics and low biological productivity of many inland waters in these northern areas lead to higher concentrations of mercury in aquatic food webs, particularly at the base of the food web, and those higher concentrations are elevated all the way through the food web. In summary, for this first part, mercury emissions to the air from human activities are a major source for the Great Lakes region. Average mercury concentrations in game fish exceed human health criteria in a large fraction of our inland waters. Mercury concentrations are high enough to adversely affect the reproduction of predatory fish in many inland waters, including inland lakes and rivers across the region. And lastly, seemingly pristine forested areas to the north are most sensitive to mercury pollution from air emissions. My colleague, Dr. David Evers from the Biodiversity Research Institute, will give the next part of our presentation. We'll swap out the microphone.
Okay, thank you. So in this effort, elevated mercury levels are found in many species of wildlife and in many different habitats in the Great Lakes region. For instance, depending on the region, 15 to nearly 30% of bald eagles studied in the region have liver mercury levels at or above important risk thresholds for birds. Additionally, high levels in mink were measured near legacy point sources. The common loon is one of the most extensively studied indicator species in North America, and we have several new results from the Great Lakes region that further support findings in other regions that there is a significant adverse impact on reproductive success for fish-eating birds like the loon. However, I'd like to point out that while the loon is well studied, it is one of the more tolerant species to methylmercury toxicity. Therefore, its use as an indicator species is likely underestimating ecological impact. Results from a new study in which mercury was injected into the eggs of common loons that were then raised and hatched in the wild further substantiate documented lower effect levels. Specifically, in these two graphs, specifically the rate of hatching success decreased with increasing mercury. That's the top graph. This is partly because incubation time was found to be abnormal, or in other words, is longer for loons with elevated mercury body burdens. That's the lower graph. And highly exposed chicks had a reduced response to fright stimulus. In other words, were more lethargic. The study calculated a new lethal concentration of 1.78 parts per million for common loon eggs, at which 50% of the eggs are not viable. Mercury exposure in loons and perch was modeled to develop male and female loon units, or MLUs or FLUs. These are standardized metrics that represent the estimated blood mercury exposure of a male or female loon for a given loon territory or water body. It increased our sample size dramatically by being able to basically make yellow perch into loons. Estimated loon blood mercury levels exceeded thresholds of 2 parts per million that are associated with at least 22% reduced fledged young in 24% of the area studied, with at least 10 samples per grid. So about a quarter of the area has significant impacts on reproductive success for loons. 7 areas of concern were identified in Michigan, Minnesota, New York, and Ontario. So further monitoring and study is needed to identify the causes, and potential reasons are related to landscape factors that have an ability to increase mercury methylation. And these findings are similar to well-studied areas east of the Great Lakes. So in summary, the more we look, the more we find. The elevated mercury measured in several wildlife species in the Great Lakes continues to increase as we look in other habitats such as wetland areas and examine mercury body burdens in songbirds and bats. New understanding to the points to more effects and lower effect levels. Finding the effect levels in eggs for loons is very prominent in understanding what are the lethal concentrations of mercury in eggs. And lastly, the focus on loons probably underestimates the problem at hand, and it's something I think it's important to keep in mind. I'd like to now hand it over to Dr. Charles Driscoll from Syracuse University.
Thanks, Dave. Good morning. So on this slide, this shows something that Jim alluded to earlier. This is a map of emission sources for the Great Lakes basin. And each point on the map represents an emission source, and this is for both the U.S. and Canada. You can see that the density of emission sources is greater to the south and west in the more developed areas and less towards the north. But the Great Lakes Basin is an important source of mercury inputs. 26% of the total mercury emissions for U.S. and Canada come from this area around the Great Lakes. So it's an important source of mercury inputs to the atmosphere. One of the exciting things about this study is that we have compiled data on temporal patterns to try to get an assessment of how mercury inputs and concentrations have changed over our measurement period. One of the challenges associated with mercury work is that we don't have good historical estimates of mercury emissions and deposition. One of the techniques that we use to try to recreate an understanding of historical mercury deposition is with sediment cores. So researchers go out and they collect cores from lakes and they section and they date and they measure these sediments for mercury, and they can recreate the loading. We are very fortunate in this study that we had a number of scientists who had worked with this approach, and we were able to compile data for 91 different lakes across the region, ranging from Minnesota all the way from Vermont. So this is a very unique and robust data set, and it's very informative to the mercury trends. So as you see on the slide, back in the day, back before industrial development, approximately 1850, there were relatively low inputs of mercury to the Great Lakes Basin. Then through the 1900s, there was a large ramping up. You can see the values, about a 3.5-fold increase in 1970, and then on to the peak years in the mid-1980s, which represents about a 5-fold increase in mercury deposition. The good news, though, is in the last bar. That represents the most recent deposition that has occurred. So over the last few years, the last 15 or so years, we've seen about a 20% decrease in mercury loading, almost down to 1970 levels. So this is indeed good news and shows that recovery is underway with respect to mercury. It's also interesting to look at the sources of emissions and how those have changed. So here we have 3 bars. The one on the upper left is U.S. emissions for 1990 and 2005, and then for the Great Lakes area, but this is all just U.S. emissions for 1990 to 2005, and then down below, global emissions. And what we see is for both the U.S. and the Great Lakes area, for U.S. emissions, there have been marked reductions in mercury emissions from 1990 to 2005. And this is cut across a number of sectors, but the most important sectors are controls that were implemented on incinerators. And this reduction in mercury is consistent with the reduction in deposition that we've seen from this study. The pattern for local and regional sources, however, is in contrast to global emissions, which are shown below, which shows a 17% increase, and largely due to increases in Asian sources. So this suggests that controls at the local level and the national level are very important in terms of controlling mercury contamination. The other good news is that we've had the fortune to have data sets for biota, for organisms, that also show the same trend. So here are slides showing trends in mercury in a number of species of fish, largemouth bass, walleye for the U.S. and Ontario. And the slide on the left, you can see that many of these species show systematic decreases in mercury, which are consistent with decreases in deposition that I just referred to a few moments ago. And you can see some of those values are actually approaching the action level of 0.3 parts per million, which is shown in red on the slide. There are also some interesting trends as shown on the right. A few of the sites, a few of the data sets are showing an uptick in mercury over the last 10 years following a long-term decrease. And this is of interest to us. It's a little bit surprising because of the decreases in deposition, but it may be due to other factors, other environmental factors that are influencing the cycling and processing of mercury. So the take-home message for the overall presentation is that mercury contamination is more extensive than previously thought. We made a major effort to try to compile large data sets, so I guess that's not surprising that we would learn more from this compilation and synthesis. We also learned, as Jim suggested, that the sensitivity of organisms, their health, they're more sensitive than we previously thought, so the effects occur at lower levels. We also know, very importantly, that past controls on emissions nationally and locally have had significant effects on the improvement of mercury contamination. But our concentrations in fish and wildlife and human exposure continue to exceed, in many areas, health risk thresholds. We would anticipate from this work that future controls on mercury would be successful in continuing to reduce mercury levels. And then finally, we think that the information from this synthesis effort will help inform decisions on mercury management that are anticipated in the near term. So I think that concludes the presentation, and if we have questions, we're happy to entertain questions.
Thank you. To ask a question, press 0 followed by 1 on your touch-tone phone. Questions will be answered in the order they are received. Again, to ask a question on the phone line, press 0 followed by a 1 now. Please hold for a moment as our system compiles your responses.
Okay, Lisa, this is Tim Eater, the moderator again. If we can, we have about 6 reporters here in the room with us, and I think you said there are about 10 reporters on the phone. So if you don't mind, we'll take the first question from the reporters on the phone.
And I'm showing that we do not have any questions on the phone line at this time.
There are no questions from reporters on the phone right now?
No, it is not.
Okay. We'll take any questions from anybody here in the room. John? Hey, John, is your microphone on?
I don't know. Let's see.
Yep.
I think it is. Yeah, I'm John Flesher. I'm with the Associated Press. The messages that are coming from this report say, on the one hand, that mercury contamination is more extensive than previously thought, and yet the levels seem to be going down in most areas, yet not everywhere. In some areas, apparently, they're coming up. And so it looks like a little bit of a mixed message here. And I wanted to, in particular, be sure I understood on the one hand, the idea of contamination being more extensive than previously thought, and yet mostly going down. Can you help me understand and reconcile those two?
You want me to take that?
Sure.
So that's an interesting and important question. This is Charlie Driscoll answering the question. I think part of the issue here is that often when we go out and we measure mercury concentrations, we find elevated concentrations, enough that would point to potential health concerns. So where we measure it, we tend to find it. So when we've gone out as part of the synthesis activity and mined data that have previously not been analyzed, we would expect that we would find additional data points to document the extensive nature of the problem. If you remember Jim's slide, he had the grid cells, some of which had relatively few data or no data points. And we would envision that as time went on and we made more measurements, that we would be able to fill out that pattern. I think another issue is just the number of records that show long-term trends. There are relatively few sites where there are measurements of long-term trends, but those ones do show two patterns. Most of them show declining patterns, but some of them show this uptick that you refer to over the last 10, 15 years. We're anticipating that the declines are largely due to declines in emissions and deposition, but in terms of the uptick, we're not really sure what's driving that pattern.
Just to follow up, this is David Evers. John, I just wanted to speak to the more we find, the more we look, the more we find. And I think a good example is in the past, the emphasis was primarily on fish and fish-eating organisms in lakes and rivers. And this past decade, there's been a lot of interest in looking at other organisms that may be at risk as well. And the findings from the Northeast and elsewhere indicate that species that live in wetland areas, in bogs, emergent wetlands, floodplain forests of rivers, for example, organisms in those habitats do tend to have elevated mercury levels, and those organisms aren't necessarily fish-eating biota. So songbirds and bats in those sort of habitats we find are regularly and commonly exceed effect levels. So that's where the more that we look, the more we find sort of phrasing comes from.
I see. And just to follow up, and I apologize, I know this is a simplistic question, but is the problem getting better or worse? If you were describing that sort of to a lay audience, what would you tell them?
This is Jim Weiner. I would like to respond to that. I think that we're really looking at two trajectories here. One is a trajectory in environmental contamination. That problem is getting better, as clearly shown here with the sediment and fish data. The other trajectory is a scientific trajectory, and that is relative to fish, for example. Most of the pertinent work on reproductive and sublethal effects of mercury on fish health has been done in the last 10 to 12 or so years. We have declining mercury levels in the environment, but what we also have are declining threshold concentrations that are known to adversely harm biota.
Lisa, we'll take any questions from reporters that might be on the phone.
Again, to ask a question on the phone line, press 0 followed by a 1 now. And we do have one question on the phone line, and that comes from Carrie Hansen of Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Please go ahead.
Hi. My question, I think, is for Dr. Driscoll. So I was just trying to see if I could follow the explanation on, it seems as if reducing regional sources are beneficial in reducing the levels in the environment because even though there's increases globally, we're seeing decreases in the local environment. Am I tracking that correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll go back to the room here, and we have a question from Noah Ovchinsky.
Noah Shinsky, Detroit Public Radio. You talk about controls at the local and national level being important as it relates to overall contamination levels going down. Could you talk about what those controls are? What has been done in the last 20 years? I'm assuming in the coal industry and the mining industry and other contributors.
Yes. The major sectors that have shown marked decreases, we could actually go to the slide to show this bar diagram here. Can you advance it? Those are incinerator sources, medical waste and municipal waste incinerators, which were very high in the early 90s, have been controlled very strongly through the 90s, and those represent the major reductions. There are some other sectors that have either been controlled by other measures, such as, for power plants, there may be controls for particulate matter that have shifted the distribution and the overall emissions, but there have been no direct control measures on mercury in power plants as a sector as a whole. That is an issue that's being considered now by the EPA and is scheduled for consideration in November to the utility rule. Other sectors that have been in place in the relatively near term include cement manufacturers, some other industrial sectors.
Okay, Lisa, we'll go back to any questions from the audience on the phone.
And I'm showing that we do not have any questions at this time.
Okay, back to the room. John?
Just following up on what you were saying about the coming EPA rule scheduled for next month. You may be aware that there's just recently a number of state officials were pushing back against that, urging EPA to hold off on that regulation or to water it down, including the Attorney General of the state of Michigan, who's involved in that. At the same time, there's legislation in the House that would try to nullify the cement plant requirements that the EPA has been promulgating. Just wondering, I realize you all are scientists and not policy experts, but just wondered if any of you had any concerns about the pushback against regulating air emissions that might have some effect on mercury.
Well, I think that we're aware of these proposals, and actually the way we view it is we view that the timing of this report is fortunate because we have a very important database for a very important region that informs managers about the mercury problem. It shows widespread contamination. It shows the fact that if you control emissions either at the national level or the local level, there will be benefits to the nation or to the region. And I think by EPA's own analysis, they've done a cost-benefit analysis that show that the benefits far outweigh the costs associated with this. But as you say, we're researchers, and we just we prefer to take the position where we would inform managers in terms of our findings and let them make the most appropriate decisions.
Okay, Lisa, back to you. Are there any questions from the audience on the phone?
Again, to ask an audio question, press 0 followed by a 1. And we have no questions. Actually, I'm sorry, we do have another question at this time that comes from Carrie Hansen of Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to check the U.S. Great Lakes states emissions. Is this all the sources that are within the basin plus that 200 kilogram boundary?
So that's a good question, and I apologize. I should have clarified that when I showed the slide. This is the slide that was shown showing the emission sources. The Great Lakes and the Great Lakes watershed is the Great Lakes watershed is actually very close to the Great Lakes themselves. The basin has a relatively small land area compared to the lake area. And there are a number of urban areas adjacent to the watershed boundary. So the map shows the watershed boundary, that's shown in blue, but also shows a 200-kilometer buffer to try to capture the emission sources that are adjacent to the boundary and adjacent to the lake. So the figure that I provided, 26% of the total emissions for the U.S. and Canada, that includes that 200-kilometer boundary of lands that are adjacent to the Great Lakes watershed. So thank you for letting me clarify that.
Thank you, and we have no further audio questions.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. We do have a couple of questions here in the room. Tina, do you have a question?
Free Press. I'm still struggling a little bit with looking at the map that shows the sources, which are all in for example, in Michigan, are all in southeast Michigan and around Chicago, whereas the worst mercury contamination, or the mercury that shows up in the fish and animals, is much further north, even for us in the Upper Peninsula, which is hours and hours, long way away. I know that you mentioned that the trees can pull mercury out of the air, but I'm just wondering about the air patterns. Where does the mercury that's in, for example, lower southern Michigan, where is the mercury in the UP coming from?
So that's a good question, and folks often struggle with this concept. As Jim indicated, when mercury enters the land, there are three possible fates of it. It can be converted to a form and go back to the atmosphere. It can be bound up in soil, what we call sequestered, and basically eliminated from the system. Or it can be transported with water to other water courses. And the situation is such that even though the emissions are higher in the south and the west portion of the region, and also I failed to mention the deposition is higher in that area, those lands are not particularly sensitive to mercury inputs. The forested areas, the wetland areas, the areas that are very nutrient poor, the more northern areas that we would see in Ontario and northern parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and New York are very sensitive. And the reason for that is threefold. The trees, because they're largely forested areas, can scavenge mercury out of the air. They can supply 3/4 of the mercury inputs to a watershed just being filtered out by trees. So they enhance the deposition. There's a lot of wetlands, and as we talked about, wetlands are very important in terms of the conversion of mercury inputs to this form of methylmercury that accumulates. And then finally, they're very nutrient poor. So normally when we think of a eutrophic lake or an algae-choked lake, we think of it as being very contaminated or polluted. But in terms of the ability of organisms to transmit mercury, the lakes that are very unproductive do that much more effectively. And it's really a matter of biomass, the amount of organisms. In an algae-choked lake, there's a lot of biomass that mercury can absorb to. But if you have relatively few organisms, the quantity of mercury is distributed among fewer organisms, so their concentrations become much higher, and that gets transmitted all the way up to fish. So lakes that are very unproductive tend to have the highest fish and animal mercury concentrations.
And the unproductive lakes, the northern part of Michigan and the region are generally less productive, more oligotrophic.
And Tim, just to add to that, this is Dave Evers. Tina, I know in the UP there are some legacy point sources too, and we should think about that for the whole region, that there are areas that have been contaminated in the past and that could be decades past that still have an impact today.
I know we have a couple more questions here in the room. Sir, did you have a question? Okay, great. Noah?
Talking about global emissions, I'm looking at the graph here. Global emissions are going up. I mean, presumably, unless those are stunted in some way, would we expect that to show up in concentrations in any sort of significance here in the next decade or so?
I think, if I gave you the impression that global emissions are not important, then that was incorrect on my part. Global emissions are clearly very important and an area of concern. Mercury is very much an international problem. There are forms of mercury. There are basically two forms of mercury that are emitted to the atmosphere. One form that travels around the globe and has a residence time of about a half a year to a year. So emissions can be transported everywhere in that form. The other form of mercury is mercury that's oxidized, that falls out very close to the source within hours or days, and that is more of a local, regional issue. So both are very important, and clearly Asian sources are very important for this region as well as, as well as globally, because they dominate the emission pattern and they're growing relatively fast. So I don't want to dismiss that, but I also think it's important message to know that local emissions have a disproportionate impact locally, and they are also extremely important.
Just a further comment to build on that. There is an international effort ongoing right now by the United Nations Environment Program to put together a global binding agreement on mercury. The third International Negotiating Committee meeting is coming up in late October, early November, and that's the third part of a series of 5 meetings. And in 2013, the plan for the United Nations is to have a global binding agreement in place and ratified by hopefully 140 countries. So there is movement at the international level to deal with this.
Great, thank you. Any other questions here in the room? Lisa, do we have any questions from anyone on the phone?
We do, and the next question comes from Kathy Lambert of Harvard Forest. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I see from your slides that you've painted a bit of a picture here of things improving. I'm just wondering if that means that, it's still not a significant problem, or whether levels are still at a point of being of concern.
Yeah, this is Charlie Driscoll. So I think that this is a good question. We do see many data sets are showing declines in concentrations in biota. I showed a few of those on the slide. But I think the other side of this is that many of these data sets show that values in fish and in animals are still generally above the values that we would expect health impacts, or that are above the U.S. EPA human health criterion in the case of fish of 0.3 parts per million. So while the situation is improving, the situation is still such that there are health impacts associated with mercury deposition in terms of human health exposure and potential health effects to fish and wildlife.
Yes, this is Jim Weiner. I would also like to add a comment, and that is that we have focused on fish and wildlife in this presentation and have really not addressed the issue of health effects in this study. But there's published work, specifically case studies published in Environmental Research by Knobloch and others a few years back, in which they did case studies on 7 individuals or families that were suffering adverse effects of methylmercury exposure. 2 of the 7 cases involved consumption of seafood. The other 5 cases involved consumption of local fish caught from area waters. And in all cases, there were sublethal adverse effects, mental confusion, sleep deprivation, problems with balance and coordination, visual impairment, and those effects diminished after people stopped eating fish in large quantities, and these people were frequent consumers of sport fish. And those symptoms stopped after they discontinued consumption of fish from waters. Now, there's a problem here in that there are many health benefits associated with consumption of fish. We would like people to be catching fish and eating fish. And unfortunately, what we have now is fisheries in many of our waters that are contaminated to a point where the people cannot really count on the health benefits by consuming fish from those waters. And so the fish consumption advice is needed. We would certainly like to see this problem diminished to a point where people can eat fish more widely from waters in the region and enjoy the health benefits without the risks.
Thank you, Dr. Weiner. Any other questions here in the room? Lisa, are there any other questions from people on the phone?
I am showing that we have no further questions at this time.
Great. Thank you very much. I want to thank all of the participants, all the people on the phone, and reporters that are here in the room. I especially want to thank our three researchers and experts today. Very nice job. Congratulations to all of you and to all of us. The Great Lakes Commission is very proud of this report and pleased with the level of collaboration. It's symbolic of the degree of cooperation and collaboration that we have on many issues throughout the Great Lakes, but this is synthesizing 35 different research papers into these two documents that were published in the peer-reviewed journals and now into the Mercury Connections report is quite an accomplishment. So thank you all very much. That ends our news conference today. Thank you.